Today on the Novelizers, comedy legend Patton Oswalt, Teresa Lee, Mike O'Gorman, and Maggie Maye, plus Asher Perlman and Steve Waltien, and intern Kevin Carter. Now here's your host, Andy Richter.
Hi, I'm your host, Andy Richter, and tonight I'm gonna turn you on. But I'm not going to arouse you with skimpy underpants or lavender potpourri. I'm gonna get you going using humanity's most potent erogenous organ, the mind. How? With new literary masterpieces that I've created by getting TV comedy writers to novelize classic films, then having actors whisper those words into your eager little ears. It sounds so wrong, but our lawyers tell us we're protected by parody law, so it's actually so right. Now dim the lights, ease your seat back, and prepare yourself to be novelized. Today on the podcast, we're novelizing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Now Kevin, my intern, is going to catch you up on the story so far. Kevin, how you doing?
Well, Andy, I'm doing real fine.
Ooh, don't do that. Only I can do the sexy voice.
Sorry about that. So far into our story, Kirk and the gang are finally back on the Enterprise. Chekhov, whose mind is still being controlled by Khan, asks Dr. Marcus to hand over the Genesis Project, but she says she's gonna have to check with Kirk first.
Thanks, Kev. First up today is a chapter novelized by Twitter superstar Maura Quint and narrated by comedy legend Patton Oswalt. Patton, make it happen.
Saavik ran toward the Enterprise's elevator. "Hold, please," she said, with a tremendous show of cool-headed logic. The sort of logic that one would think could, for example, someday be used to recognize if a religion was actually just a multi-million-dollar Tupperware scam for Hollywood celebs, or if, say, a former TV host turned president were actually a vaguely sentient sack of wet, rotting circus peanuts, but today was only used to alert Shatner to keep the door open. "Lieutenant, are you wearing your hair differently?" Shatner shatnered. "It's still regulation, Admiral," she said, with what would seem, if she were human, like a slight blush. Shatner checked her up and down, noting her breasts seemed very regulation indeed. Indeed. "May I speak, sir?" Saavik asked, despite the fact that talking to ask if you can talk is not very logical at all, to be honest. What are we playing at here? "Self-expression doesn't seem to be one of your problems," Shatner responded. It was his best line, and yet, for reasons he could not understand, she didn't swoon, which reminded him of another test she'd recently failed. "You're bothered by your performance on the Kobayashi Maru." "I failed to resolve the situation," she replied. "There is no correct resolution. It's a test of character." "May I ask how you dealt with the test?" she asked. Shatner paused. All of the many human and half-alien children he'd certainly fathered and abandoned came to him in an instant, filling him with an overwhelming need to dad joke just this once. "You may ask," he replied, so goddamn pleased with himself you could smell it. "It smelled of hot dogs and someone spilled Miller Lite." "That's a little joke," he added. "Humor," Saavik answered. "It is a difficult concept. It is not logical. Your comedians say they are stand-up, when you can clearly see from their weak thighs they spend most time sitting down. When they are happy, they say they killed, but that is something they only do driving home after a show because the venue paid them in whiskey. When they are not happy, they say they bombed, but bombs kill many people, which should therefore make them happy. Is it not so? They have many discussions about punching up and punching down, but I have seen very few who are able to punch at all. They mostly run away. Some hide. They ask, 'What is the deal?' but do not answer. I am left wondering, what is the deal with Starship food?" And, "Admiral Kirk," the intercom buzzed, fortunately. "Kirk here. I have an urgent contact from Space Lab Radio 1 for you, sir. Dr. Carol Marcus." Eager to escape the chick who was hot until she started talking comedy, Shatner responded, "I'll take it in my quarters," and rushed out the elevator doors. On the Zoom call in his room, Shatner's old flame, Dr. Carol Marcus, appeared. "Jim, can you read me?" "I can hear you, Dr. Carol Marcus. What's wrong? What's the matter?" "Why are you taking Genesis away from us?" Dr. Carol Marcus implored. Taking Genesis? Who's taking Genesis? It wasn't Phil Collins' fault. Peter Gabriel chose to leave. Jim, did you mute? I can't hear you. Hit the mute button. It's on the bottom. Jim, did you give the order? Jim, unmute yourself. This is your ship. How do you still not know how to use this? What order? Captain Shatner asked. I can't see you. Did you turn off your camera? Who's taking Genesis? Which album? Why can't I see you? This is becoming the land of confusion. The screen transformed into the TV from Poltergeist, but Dr. Carol Marcus's disjointed voice was still coming through. Please help us, Jim. I will not let them have Genesis without proper authorization. Whose authority? Only Banks and Rutherford really have final say. What is happening? Control what's happening! Transmission jammed at the source, sir. Alert Starfleet headquarters. I want to talk to Starfleet Command. Meanwhile, aboard the supersized satellite of love known as Regula 1, the transmission had failed, and Dr. Carol Marcus was trying to quiet her arguing crew, who feared they'd been abandoned. Her curly-haired son, David, who she apparently had as a teenager, which, frankly, invites a lot of additional questions that no brain-altering earworms are going to answer, but was at least worth mentioning, was furious. He knew the score. I tried to tell you before, David shouted. Scientists have always been pawns of the military. But the come on, isn't she too young to be his mother, Dr. Carol Marcus was having none of it. Starfleet has kept the peace for 100 years. I cannot and will not subscribe to your interpretation of this event, she retorted, with the confidence of a woman who'd never questioned why the cops who pulled her over had never once given her a ticket. Shatner was pacing on the Enterprise as Spock, always the steady hand, patiently waited. We have a problem. Something may be wrong on Regula 1. We've been ordered to investigate. If memory serves, Spock replied, as though his memory could fail, as though he wasn't perfect, as though his ears were curved like some kind of woman-chasing, human-shaped asswad, Regula 1 is a scientific research laboratory. Shatner ignored him, searching the room instead for either a hot lady or something that reflected his own face back to stare at. Neither available, he settled for silently undressing the luscious curve of a chair's arm. I told Starfleet Command all we have was a boatload of children, but we're the only ship in the quadrant. Spock, these cadets of yours, how good are they? How will they respond under real pressure, he asked, wondering if that chair's legs went all the way up. As with all living things, each according to his gifts, Spock said, like that was any damn help at all. Of course, the ship is yours. No, that won't be necessary, at least not after I fuck this chair, Shatner thought. Just get me to Regula 1. As a teacher on a training mission, I am content to command the Enterprise, Spock said. But if we are to go to actual duty, it is clear that the senior officer on board must assume the command. God, he was exhausting. It may be nothing, Shatner said, now thinking of a chair showroom he once saw that had, so many sexy chairs, just a ton, all of them crazy hot. Garbled communications, you take the ship. Shatner, you proceed from a false assumption. I'm a Vulcan. I have no ego to bruise. Yeah, I know you're fucking perfect, Spock. I get it. You don't have to fucking remind me every time. I should not remind you of that which you know so well, Spock said, perfectly ignoring Shatner's tone and the way he kept licking his lips while looking at the furniture. If I may be so bold, it was a mistake for you to accept a promotion. Commanding a starship is your first best destiny. Anything else is a waste of material. I would not presume to debate you, Shatner answered. That is wise. I'd have to set up my podcast for that, and the microphones are in the other room. In any case, were I to invoke logic, logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or of the one. Neo, heard of him? Neat guy. Kept going on about some spoon or no spoon. Maybe it was a fork? I don't know. He was all bendy. We didn't hang out long, Shatner replied. Spock nodded, once, briskly. You're my superior officer. You're also my friend. I have been and always shall be yours. Shatner eyed him up and down. Maybe later there was work to do. The two strode into the bridge home. Shatner took control. An emergency situation has arisen. By order of Starfleet Command, as you know, 1800 hours, I'm assuming command of this vessel. Duty officer, open the ship's log. Plot a course for Space Laboratory Regula 1. Prepare for warp speed. A student raised his hand. So, does this count for our grade? The answer was lost. The ship jetted forward into a laser Floyd show, and everyone braced for the vibes, unaware those vibes were about to shift. Meanwhile, in another different yet oddly similar part of space, like Space Canada or something, the ship Reliant continued flying, or hurtling, or swimming. Course to intercept the Enterprise ready, sir, said a 90s chud aboard the Reliant. Khan's chest beamed back. Excellent. May I speak? The chud continued. We're all with you, sir, but consider this. We are free. We have a ship, and the means to go where we will. We have escaped permanent exile. You have proved your superior intellect and defeated the plans of Admiral Kirk, and do not need to defeat him again. We have a ton of weed, and I'm pretty sure we just passed a planet that had signs for froyo. Khan's chest sparkled. His nipples blinked. The mouthful of his abs pursed. He tasks me, and I shall have him. Have you ever read Moby Dick? Because it has some great stuff in there, the chest continued. No reason, I was just asking. Anyway, I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia, and round the Antares maelstrom, and round perdition's flames before I give him up. Prepare to alter course. The Enterprise warped down. Space Station, Regular One, please come in, comms tried. It's no use, there's no response from Regular One. But it's no longer jammed? Kirk asked. No, but there's no longer anything. There are two possibilities. They're unable to respond or they're unwilling to respond. How far are we? 43 minutes present speed. Shatner replayed his conversation with Dr. Carol Marcus, mumbling to himself. Give up Genesis, she said. What in God's name does it mean? Give it up to whom? There's no longer a viable frontman. It makes no sense. Overhearing, Spock offered. It might help my analysis if I knew what Genesis was beyond a biblical reference. Shatner's eyes widened. Uhura, have Dr. McCoy join us in my room. Tell him the lamb lies down on Broadway. He'll know what you mean. Saavik, you have the comm.
Super stuff. As always, here's my intern Kevin with an interview with one of the fine folks who worked on the film Wrath of Khan. Kevin, who did you talk to this time?
Hello, I'm Kevin Carter, and I am Andy's cook, masseuse, driver, church league basketball coach, and recently his Reiki practitioner. And I'm your host for the interview portion of the Novelizers. Today, I'm here with Stephen Asher, who had the enviable job of keeping acting legend Ricardo Montalban's skin oiled for his film debut on Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Now let's talk to the sex pectoral mechanics and find out what it took to keep Ricardo Montalban shimmering on screen. How's it going, fellas? How you doing?
Excellent. So happy to be able to talk about this work all these years later.
Yeah, it's an honor.
I say let's get right into it. First, I think the people want to know, how did you two guys meet?
Well, we met in college. I was in college and Asher was not. But I was getting my degree from Cornell in theater. And I was oiling a production of The Tempest that needed something extra. It needed some drama to it. And for me, I was attracted to Prospero's chest. And Asher at the time was someone I encountered at a Jiffy Lube.
That's right. Yeah, I was at the Jiffy Lube. I was working there. I was performing oil changes, and I got into that because I was so passionate about oil. My dad is an oil painter, and so I always wanted to follow in his footsteps a little bit. And he got to talking about his work, oiling in theater, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, that's good. Now, so for the listeners out there, I don't know if you know, because I didn't know at first either. I don't think they mean like dark black oil when they're talking about oiling people, because if you watch the movie, I don't think Ricardo Montalban's oil is black. But can you talk about for the listeners, what type of oil it takes to do your job when it comes to being a pectoral mechanic?
Yeah, it's not the kind of oil that you would burn in your car. We're talking about a kind of a translucent petroleum that is used on the skin to highlight glistening and to catch light. We are as much artists of light as anybody who uses lights, to illuminate a shot. We are painting with our petroleum on a canvas, which is provided by Mr. Montalban, and we're using that to catch and reflect light in a way that tells a story to the audience.
So what were your thoughts when you realized that both of your next job at the time would be rubbing and caressing oil all over Ricardo Montalban's chess for months, so while in production. What was your guys' thoughts behind that?
It's so funny because you don't have a lot of time to emotionally react or think. On a project like this, it's so big, you get right into storyboarding. And what I did is I said, look, we need a topographical map of the chest area. Mm-hmm. And each shot, you want to plan exactly where you're glistening and exactly the kind of reflections that you want.
We are obviously primarily in charge of making the chest shine. That's undeniable. But without the incredible team behind us and the incredible collaborators we worked with, we couldn't do what we needed to do. So first thing I did was get on the phone, call everyone on the team, get on the same page. Like Steve said, get a map together, storyboard this thing out, get a plan in place.
So you guys have seemed to be working for a while and really, got a good handle on, say each other's style and how you guys work, which is a beautiful thing. But, in reality and in life, it isn't always like that. Has there been times where you guys just didn't see eye to eye or disagree on anything?
Well, we're like brothers at this point. Yeah. And, so that means, are there times when we're going to be mad at each other when, of course there are. Brothers notoriously try to kill one another.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Well, no, little kids, they don't know what they're doing. They try to, and so if at one point you get mad and you're in a parking lot, you try to drive your car over your friend, that.
Did that happen?
I'm just saying as an example,
well, okay.
Like if you try to drive your car over your friend,
Yeah, and this is a dynamic as old as time. The famous, the first Cain and Abel, right? It's just baked into the relationship. So, say for example, if over a creative difference, one of the brothers threatens to poison the other when he's least expecting it,
That's the kind of stuff that happens. And
exactly.
Then the other, and then in reaction to that, you're like, oh my God, when is it coming? Right. And
yeah.
You're up at night thinking like, okay, it could happen any time. Is my pillow poisoned? But you can be mad about that stuff, or you can react in fear, or you can say like, okay, well now I'm on my toes.
Yeah, and then the obvious response to that as well is when you least expect it. So if you're thinking maybe it's going to happen now because you're on your toes, well, it's not going to happen then, and that's what makes the threat so exciting. But that's just part of being brothers.
Look, at the end of the day is over, and you have to realize that if you don't work with counterparts who know how to bring out the best in you, then your work is not going to be as great as it can be. So you always come back to that.
Yeah. You come back to your brother.
Was there any other places on the body of Ricardo that you had to oil?
We offered to oil the forehead, but the bangs were feathered so perfectly it just wouldn't have shown through. But yeah. Steve, if I remember correctly, there was a day we had to oil the arms.
Yeah, we went arms. And that's important, it's not chest important, but it is important. An actor like Ricardo, he's going to be oiling in places that you don't see in order to feel more confident and powerful. So yeah, we do some under costume oiling as well, but that's different from camera oiling.
Yeah, so thank you guys for joining us and being a part of this. For the listeners, thank you for listening to the interview portion of the Novelizers. I have been Kevin Carter. I'm here with Steve and Asher. Please enjoy the rest of the film.
Thanks, Kevin. Our next chapter was novelized by Joe Fusion. It sounds like a stage name. And it was so long, it took 3 whole people to narrate it. First up is stand-up comedian Maggie Maye. Maggie Maye, take it away.
Chapter 8, Genesis Begins, by Joe Fusion. Part 1. McCoy stomped down the hallway, lost in thought, but still glowering at the red shirts out of habit. They're back on a ship together one day, and already this old competition was starting up. He found himself obsessively rehearsing what to say, practicing his entrance in his mind, to look cool in front of him. Even after all these years, he was still vying for Kirk's precious favor. He thought back to the beginning and shuddered with embarrassment. Even in his very first week on Enterprise 1.0, he had been desperate to weasel in close to his new captain. He and Spock had been walking down a hallway, much like this one, when he decided to test the mettle of this half-alien weirdo. "Listen, Spock," he said. "You've got to admit, this captain needs a real man at his side. A whole man as his second in command." And that smarmy bastard had paused, raised that accursed eyebrow, and brain-punched him right in the balls. "Dr. McCoy, you are definitely a whole, and I'm sure you could handle the captain's number 2. Not a crack of a smile, only the barest inflection in his voice. Then he walked away while McCoy stood stunned in front of a bunch of red shirts. Red shirts! For years after, he dreamed of scraping off those luscious eyebrows with a rusty laser scalpel. But surely that was behind them now. That was a long, long time ago. Far, far away. And yet here he was, rushing to the Admiral's quarters. The Admiral's quarters. Giddy and anxious as a child on Federation sorting day. "Get it together, man. You're acting like a new cadet, wet behind the ears, fresh out of spaceship school. Is that who you are? No. You are Bones. Bones doesn't have nerves like this. Bones isn't brittle or white with fear." He knew this, deep down in his core. He'd worked his fingers to the breaking point to get here, and he didn't have a timid part left in his body. He was a full-grown man, and it was time to act like it. Oh, and even more than all that, he was a goddamn space doctor. At this point, he was basically king of the space doctors. He'd waved his doctor wand over more dead crew members than any 10 other doctors. He'd been splattered with alien fluids that they still couldn't identify. He'd filled out death certificates for stars. He'd once patched up a wounded time worm with nothing more than old dilithium crystals, hot glue, and grit. What could possibly make a man of his caliber quiver? And then he was at the door. Admiral Kirk's door. He steadied himself, gathered up every gram of sassy apathy at his disposal. Stepping into the room, he declared, "Well, I've got the sick bay ready. Now will someone please tell me what's going on?" Silence. Oh no. What had he done? How badly had he misread the situation? "McCoy, you fool!" The empty quiet stretched on and on, out into the boundless darkness of his soul. Spock stared at him, through him, beyond him, in blank triumph. He reeled internally while doing his best not to reel on the outside. His mind grasped for a comeback, but it wasn't made for grasping. His hands were doing an equally bad job of thinking. Finally, after what seemed like several units of time had passed, Kirk's lip curled into the barest hint of a smile. A consolation smirk. The Admiral had thrown him a thing, and he took it. The other two men turned to face an artful pattern of rectangles and lines on the far wall. These were revealed to be the sliding buttons and painted over lights of a huge, impossibly advanced computer. The new Enterprise had been outfitted with the Federation's very best technology, and wow, it showed. Kirk spoke, and the electronic miracle before them sparkled and shimmered as if it understood. Strange symbols began to fly onto the screen from every direction, up, down, left. McCoy forgot about his own shit. This was real. He watched in awe as Kirk rattled off a stream of arcane security jargon and commands. The mechanical brain lurched into action, a whirlwind of light and sound, incomprehensible to the organic mind. From this glittering swirl, an image emerged, and the sense of awe that had filled McCoy's spirit was completely replaced by a foreboding sense of awe. Somehow, this mere automation of steam levers and electro gears had done the impossible. It had displayed a realistic image of a human face. Not the words, "a human face." Not an artist's rendition of a face. It was an actual human face. one he knew as well as his own. James Tiberius Kirk. But something was wrong. Here sat the man himself, close enough to touch, more alive than anyone had a right to be. The face that started back from the screen was a twisted mockery, a portal into nightmare. In this dark mirror, a great and mighty jaw hung slack and frozen. The twinkling eyes that simultaneously welcomed and penetrated were instead locked into an endless, vacant stare. One socket bore a garish red stain, but not the vital scarlet of blood or bruise, as he had wiped from this face so many times. Nor was it the fading ruddiness of a fresh corpse, equally familiar to him. No, it was a cold splash of wan, artificial red that had so lazily and asymmetrically desecrated that face. It was horrible, and it chilled McCoy to the very inside of him. He clenched everything inside of him that could be clenched, choking down a bestial scream that, should it escape from his bloodless lips, would almost certainly be really embarrassing.
Thanks, Maggie. Part 2 was narrated by Mike O'Gorman, who you've seen on Ted Lasso, True Lies, and The Tonight Show. Make it so, Mike.
Chapter 8, Part 2, novelized by Joe Fusion, narrated by Mike O'Gorman. The computer wall clicked and beeped, plodding along while Kirk practiced gritting his teeth. Besides being slow and loud, the device was also dumping heat into the room. That could be a good excuse to take his shirt off. The fabric was crazy itchy, and he always felt more free in the buff. He remembered asking the machine a question, like several minutes ago. He'd even gussied up the request with some extra techno-babble to impress the others while the computer's motor warmed up. But now what? Was it waiting on him? Summary, please. It had been waiting. The electronic gears inside the wall clanked and whirred. He imagined smashing the nerd who built this thing. Probably go down with a single neck chop. The TV part of the wall finally got less stupid and then switched over to a decent-looking girl face. Maybe this computer wasn't all bad. Then the face started talking, and he realized this was the summary thing he'd asked for. He stared at her mouth as the words happened, and he was struck by the feeling that he knew her. More than that, he was pretty sure they had done it. He looked over to Spock, hoping his alien superbrain would know this lady's name. And he did. Carol Marcus, he said, without Kirk even needing to ask. Nice. See? Not all nerds are useless. Yeah, Carol Marcus sounded right. As she went on talking about whatever he'd asked, other pictures started to bubble up through his brain. Interesting. It had been a bunch of stardates ago, and assuming these pictures were memories, they had done it. A lot. Like, really a lot. He must have known this lady for a while to have done it so much. Unfortunately, that meant he needed to take a closer look at these memories. This could be one of those situations where his past self found a way to reach forward and screw up his present. Damn! He hated time travel. He zoned out for a bit, categorizing and ranking the memories. They included several very fine examples of doing it, which was rewarding. Some of these should have been in his regular daydream rotation. A few memories included snippets of conversation, and he put it together that she was a science lady. She'd been impressed by his punching and shooting and how people jumped when he yelled at them. She liked to see weird space stuff, so he had shown her the inside of quite a few spaceships. That was one of his favorite fast tracks to doing it. Commandeer a small ship, then set course for the nearest nebula, or whatever that would make the ship vibrate. Then it was clear the bridge. If these memories were to be believed, he'd even taken her joyriding in the Enterprise a few times. They must have been really good at doing it. He was distracted from this important research when the computer started showing something different. The lady's face left the screen, though somehow she kept talking. That stirred more memories of her talking, sometimes even when he wasn't even looking at her. She'd say some science thing, he'd say something cool, and then they'd get back to doing it. The view screen displayed a bunch of moving dots and lines. almost like they were flying through a giant space molecule or an alien made of math. He didn't recognize it as a monster that he'd fought or done it with, but that was hardly definitive. The screen then started talking about the Genesis device, which he was pretty sure he'd heard somewhere else recently. It was all very boring. But then he saw the device and the computer's drawing of how it could simultaneously blow up and do it with an entire planet. And just like that, the pieces fell into place. This science lady might as well have named her rocket Kirk, for all the subtlety of it. She'd heard the stories of the many things he'd done it with, and knew her competition was way more than rainbow ladies and foxy lizards. There was the time he'd done it with a liquid robot from the future. There had been that transparent spaceship that was also the ghost of a clam. Hell, he was pretty confident he'd done it with another universe once. The ship had bumped into a strange hole out near the edge of space. He ordered Scotty to design him a custom spacesuit for the encounter with lots of cameras and science probes. That memory made him chuckle inside of himself, like, with his mouth closed. So, obviously, Carol Lady was trying to get his attention. She'd built a bomb full of cosmic seeds, and surprise, surprise, she was yanking old Kirk toward it. Most likely, she'd need their help to carry it, or he'd have to save her from bandits or whatever. This could actually turn out to be a pretty cool adventure. It would definitely involve doing it. That much was clear. Maybe even some entirely new types of doing it. Maybe they'd be the first ones to do it on this new planet. Oh, how he liked the sound of that. On the screen, the simulation of a lifeless moon was changing before their eyes. Seamlessly, almost magically, the computerized graphics were replaced by a real, actual world. Their perspective raced over a verdant landscape more lush and bountiful than any he'd ever imagined. A wave of vertigo struck him, and he thought, this must be what it's like to fly. It felt like if he leaned too far forward, he would tumble through the TV right into another world. It was so mesmerizing. He almost stopped thinking about doing it. He looked up to Spock to get the nerd's reaction to all this. Fascinating, he offered, and his angular face parts creased slightly like an expression. Sweet. When Spock got this excited about something, he'd do all the boring homework, and Kirk could focus on the fun stuff. And speaking of fun, he could feel McBones jittering around behind him, gathering up steam for a disagreement with Spock. In the old days, it had been a favorite pastime to dream up new ways to make these two argue. Besides being reliably hilarious, it also made this cakewalk of a job even easier. Their advice to him almost always came from opposing extremes, which meant Kirk could do whatever he wanted and play it off as a compromise. On those rare occasions when they'd agree, it was all the more vital that he ignore them and crank up the Kirk. Put the ship in reverse. Punch the ambassador. Transport directly into the warp core. It was that kind of inspired jackassery that had made him the most famous captain he knew and had won him all these colorful buttons on his shirt. He turned around to watch the show.
Thank you, Mr. O'Gorman. Now, to conclude our three-parter, here's stand-up comedian and internet superstar Teresa Lee. Teresa Lee, engage.
This is Chapter 8, Part 3. The modern Spock civilization begins with the arrival of an entity known as Spock Zero, or the most logical one. It was this being who introduced the Spock people to the basic precepts of logicalness. The teachings of Spock Zero quickly became the foundation of all Spock society. The basic principles were taught to every child while still in the womb, and were repeated every day by everyone on Spock World. Dedication to this path had brought peace to the Spocks, and had also provided them with the air of detached superiority that was so prized throughout the Federation. Even as Spock himself stood in the room with the humans Kirk and McCoy, staring at a computer wall, most of his magnificent brain was happily occupied with repeating the rules of logicality. Only a single tiny brain wrinkle was dedicated to partaking in conversation, and that wrinkle was bored. To a Spock, a conversation was simply saying the next most logical thing. Two Spocks conversed by taking turns, each contributing proportionally to their most recent logical rankings. When a Spock and a human had a conversation, the human invariably talked way too much, and the Spock occasionally interjected logically, was called the winner. When one of the humans looked at him or said his name, his little conversation nub would logically tell his mouth what to say logically. Frequently, it proved most logical for him to speak the name of whatever it was they were gaping at. Other times, the unfortunate brain part would need to decide whether or not the current topic was fascinating. On this particular day, he had been reciting the rules of Spock for several minutes when the brain wrinkle on duty called for his attention. He noticed that McCoy was sweaty and gross, which were clear signs of illogic. Kirk was grinning, so Spock assumed that he had just won an argument. The logical next step would be to win even more, really grinding the logic into McCoy's dumb face, in the hopes that he might learn to be more logical. This hope had proven vain over the years, but it was still fun, and it was logical to have more fun than less fun. The intercom buzzed, and it was Savik, the she-Spock. The interruption obviously irked Kirk, but he perked up from his lurk with a jerk at the prospect of work, quirking his ear and shirking the smirk. It seemed that they had encountered a ship out here in space, and logically it would be a spaceship. Kirk immediately began warming up his punching and yelling muscles, and McCoy shriveled in relief. When Savik said that the other ship was the Reliant, Kirk nearly burst with joy at recognizing a name. As the Admiral shoved past them to get to the bridge, Spock slid his foot into the logical place that would cause McCoy to fall over. Logically, that happened. Spock arrived on the bridge as Kirk was shouting at everyone to do what they were already doing. To be completely fair, and also logical, many of them did perform their jobs more quickly when yelled at. Also, it was fun to watch them yell, and again, logical to have more fun. The communication specialist with decades of experience was saying something. But Spock ignored her because he was busy being logical, and Kirk because he was being loud. His latest shout was, "Try the emergency channels." This was aimed at the highly trained Starship crew who were clearly doing that already. "Picture, Mr. Savik, picture!" Kirk was pointing impatiently at the big view screen, desperate to see what everyone else had been looking at, but bigger. A dot appeared on the black screen. Uhura sat at the communication console, waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. She had already prepared and executed 13 different communication protocols and had the computer scanning a pattern of modulation variants that corrected for most common equipment malfunctions and interference sources. Really, the computer itself did 90% of the work, allowing her to focus on anomalies and exceptions that called for truly creative solutions. Spock said something at her. "Attempt visual communication." She sighed deeply and pressed that button again. Then Kirk came up with the brilliant hypothesis that communications might not be working because the Reliance communication system might not be working. And then Spock affirmed this in the most non-committal way possible. Wow. Somehow, these two had been promoted to the top of Starfleet by alternately shouting obvious things and finding fancy ways to say, duh. There were worse leaders to bet your career on, she assumed. Aboard the Reliant, the one known as Khan giggled to himself, fidgeting about in the captain's throne with a godlike restlessness. Around him, his family of genetically advanced superhumans were preparing for space battle, shaving their bodies, putting sticks into their hair, and smashing guns apart to make spearheads. His most trusted followers were at the starship's consoles, replacing buttons with bits of bone and hammering the screens into more pleasing shapes. He had tasked one of the young prodigies with pushing food scraps and waste into the air vents, and she was cleverly mashing goo through a grate with her bare feet. Slow to 1/2 impulse power. Let's be friends. By Khan, that sounded strong. Firm and authoritative, right? One of his glorious children, resplendent in upcycled clothing, grunted confirmation from the helm. His most beautiful child, glorious Joachim, was working the comms. Joachim's life vest was second in glory only to his own, and the lad's bare chest was as greasy and hard as the cement in an old garage. His flaxen hair had been braided and knotted like the ropes on an abandoned dock, and his eyes sparkled with authority and potential. Joachim was his chosen successor, and it was clear to everyone why. This future king of men turned to face his father, then muttered boldly, They're requesting visual communication, sir. Ah, what a glorious specimen. The apple certainly didn't fall far from the tree, did it? And this tree drops several apples a day. More than enough to keep Dr. Kirk away. Let them eat static, Con quipped effortlessly. He was so good at this, he'd forgotten how naturally proficient he was at captaining a ship. To be fair, he was essentially a professional everything thanks to all the extra genes those scientists had pumped into him. He particularly excelled at saying clever things, maybe even more so than lifting stuff. In this most delicious of moments, he felt the need to say something salty yet spicy. He wanted to savor it, slow and steady like a turtle soup. But he also needed to strike the iron while he was still hot, or 3 strikes and they'd be out. Had to use their hot potato or end up in hot water. Stayed cool as a cucumber, but no cold feet when it's time to be cold-hearted. There! That was it! He had it. The perfect quip. All he needed to do was get the attribution right, and this utterance would reverberate through the ages, echoing his excellence. Ah, Kirk, my old friend. Do you know the Klingon proverb that tells us revenge is a dish that is best served cold? Everyone in the room froze. Perfectly on theme, he noted, waiting for Khan to deliver the coup de grace. It is very cold. In space. Yes, he had nailed it. Oh, that was so Khan, so him. Yes. Now they waited for it to get back to Kirk. By grapevine, presumably? He wondered if any of his guys were friends with Kirk's crew. Probably should have checked earlier.
Thank you, Teresa. Wow, that was a long episode. Now, I know it's past all your bedtimes, so I'm going to turn things over to Kevin, and he's going to guide this spaceship to a nice, soft landing.
Thanks, Andy. And thanks to this week's guest contributors, Maura Queen, Joe Fusion, Maggie Maye, Mike O'Gorman, Teresa Lee, Asher Perlman, and Steve Waltien. Links to their fabulous book, swag, and cameo accounts can all be found in the show description. The Novelized was created by Stephen Levinson, produced by Stephen, Chris Karwowski, and Rob Kuttner, and edited, mixed, and mastered by Chris Karwowski. Music by Cole Emoff, Andrew Lynn, Mike Wilson, and Chris Messick. Production assistance by Suchetis Bokil. Special thanks to Sarah Mabe, Crystal Dennis, Dennis DeClaudio, and Hannah Levinson. Follow The Novelizers on Instagram and Twitter at The Novelizers, or visit thenovelizers.com. The Novelizers is a work of parody, unauthorized by Paramount, Roddenberry Entertainment, or Star Trek. I'm Andy's intern, Kevin Carter. Till next time.
Novelizers out.